Welcome. My name is Mr. Abbott, and today I'm going to be talking about building a setting, how to create a world for your reader. Now, I've started off here with an example of a setting from the author Ursula Le Guin. This is the beginning of her novel, A Wizard of Earthsea. She says, "The island of Gaunt, a single mountain that lifts its peak a mile above the storm-racked Northeast Sea, is a land famous for wizards. From the towns in its high valleys to the ports on its dark, narrow bays, many Gauntishmen has gone forth to serve the lords of the archipelago in their cities as wizards or mage, or looking for adventure to wander the working magic from isle to isle of all of Earthsea. Of these, some say the greatest, and surely the greatest voyager, was a man called Sparrowhawk, who in his day became both Dragon Lord and Archmage." And so if we look at this, we can take a closer look at how many details Le Guin puts into the setting here. Let's highlight some of those details. And so she says the island of Gaunt. Immediately you know that this is an island place. It's a single mountain that lifts its peak a mile above the storm-racked North Sea coast. So you know it's a single island. It's not like a spreading range of mountains. It's one single mountain, and it's in a storm-racked Northeast Sea, which makes you think that it's cold, right, and wet. The land famous for wizards. And so this is part of the setting too, because it's telling about the culture and expectations of the town. Towns in its high valleys, and so it has valleys, ports on its dark, narrow bays. Once again, these are all details that are helping to build the picture of what this place is like. And so Le Guin does a really good job of showing exactly what this place where the reader is going to start out is like. It's like building a foundation of a house. It helps you build the rest of your story on top of it. Because once your reader can imagine the place, now they can imagine people in the place doing things in that place. So setting is something you usually want to establish early on in your story, unless for some reason you're keeping the setting secret for something. And so the first thing to think about when you're doing a setting is what are the elements of the geographical place? What is the locale? And so locale is a fancy place of saying where. And so this is what you typically think of when you think of setting. Where is it? And so what are the features of this place? Does it have buildings of certain types, plants? Is there a room or rooms that it takes place in? Is there a layout to this place? What is the place that the setting takes place? And so this is typically what people think of when they think of setting. What is the place where something is happening? But that's not entirely it. You also need to think about time. And so there are two different types of time that you should be thinking about. The time of year. So when does this story take place on the Earth calendar? What is the season? Are there holidays that are happening? And if the story doesn't take place on Earth, you're going to have to maybe do some extra work explaining what the seasons are to the audience so they know what it is that's going on in the story. Because they're used to Earth. If you're doing something that's not Earth, they're going to need a little bit more explanation. The other type of time that you want to really put into your story is the time of day. So when does your story take place in the 24 hours of the day? Some stories usually happen at night, such as ghost stories or paranormal. I mean, occasionally you have a ghost story that happens during the day, but I think most ghost stories happen at night. And so some stories are just made weirder if they happen at unexpected times, like a soccer game that occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning or midnight, or somebody who wakes up every day near evening, like well after lunch, 4 or 5 in the afternoon, they get out of bed. Your reader's going to be immediately like, wait, that's strange. What's going on there? People don't usually wake up at that hour, except they're a student on distance learning. All right, and so here's an example of locale and time. Now, what you want to do when you're giving your setting is it's much better to show than to tell. Because if you tell somebody it's on the California coast on a fall evening, great. You've told them where it is, you've told them when it is, and what time of day it is. That's great if your reader knows what it's like to be on a California coast on a fall evening. If they don't know what that's like, that's not going to help them. And so usually it's better to just show somebody, right? So here we wrote, the sun touched the horizon, filling the small gap between the ocean and the ceiling of clouds. A long glimmering carpet of sunlight trailed across the water to the setting sun. The clouds caught the sunlight on inverse hills. A wave crashed against a towering pillar of rock, turning black against the sunset. And so here you have a little bit more visual detail. And once again, this has to do with sensory detail. It's sharing the sights and sounds, touches, tastes, smells of the setting, and allows the reader, even if they don't know specifically what it's like, to put themselves in that moment. Now, something else to think about is the climate of a place. And so are there weather patterns in this place? Is the weather hostile or friendly to the characters? And so I put kind of a famous example here from Jack London's To Build a Fire, a story in which a character ends up dying of hypothermia because they're not careful in the climate that they've been put in. And so Jack London writes here, the Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white, north and south, as far as his eyes could see. It was unbroken white. The one thing that relieved the whiteness was a thin dark line that curved from the pine-covered island to the south. It curved into the north, where it disappeared behind another pine-covered island. This dark line was the trail, the main trail. And so here Jack London is setting the scene and establishing the setting. He's telling you that it was white, ice, and snow. So immediately, even though he doesn't say anywhere that it's cold, you understand that it's cold. Not just because there's a little bit of ice, but feet and feet of ice and then snow on top of it, right? You can't even see anything that's not unbroken white. And then you have this dark line of a trail that's getting put into the story. And once again, Jack London is probably assuming that his reader does not know what it's like to be in Alaska on the Yukon Trail. And so instead of telling the reader that it's in Alaska on the Yukon Trail, he paints a picture with words, with senses, to help the reader imagine where they are. And now the reader, even if they've never been there or seen a picture of the Yukon, they now know that it's this bleak white place covered in snow and pine-covered islands. Another aspect of the setting can be the mood and the atmosphere. And so while these are not concrete things, the feeling of a place is also important. So is the general vibe of the place relaxed, hostile, friendly, stressed, nervous, something else? And see if you can show this without saying that the mood was relaxed, because that's not quite as helpful as saying that giving the reader a specific example of the relaxing mood. And so here's an example from a poem called The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And this does a really good job of establishing the mood, right? He says, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. And so here, Poe has begun to establish the mood. He does so much more as the poem progresses. But we immediately see that it's a midnight, dreary, which means really tired. So the middle of the night, really tired. He pondered, he was thinking, weak and weary. So he's tired, sleepy, over many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. He's reading like this really old, forgotten book. It's the middle of the night. He's tired. And all of a sudden, somebody comes knocking on his door. And so this is kind of a creepy thing to happen. You have to imagine that you're home alone. It's the middle of the night, maybe like 1 or 2 in the morning. Then all of a sudden, just somebody's gently knocking on your door. It's going to be creepy, right? And so this is establishing the mood of the story is just a little bit off-putting and creepy. So another thing to think about that's part of the setting is oftentimes the population. And so what are the people like in this setting? Who are they? And also think about who is the audience of your story? Who are you telling this story to? Would the audience of your story easily be able to identify these people? And if not, you probably need to describe them, especially if you're telling about a part of the world where your audience has probably never been. Is this place crowded or empty? These are all things. And so individual people in a story are characters. But the general people that fill up the story, like background actors in a movie, they're more part of the setting, right? You don't know anything about them. They just make up the landscape. And so the people who don't really interact with the character, who are there, think of them more as part of the setting than individual characters because they really don't have an impact on the story other than just being part of what's going on around the character. And so here's a beginning of a story from Shirley Jackson called The Lottery, right? And so once again, you'll see that she does a good job of showing the time, the locale, the people, maybe a little bit of the mood is getting established here, right? The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square, between the post office and the bank. Then around 10 o'clock, in some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the lottery took only 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner here. And so once again, she's beginning to discuss the culture of the people, the locale, the time. All these things are helping to establish what's going on in this story. And the last thing to think of is what is the social, political, or cultural climate going on in this story? Because these oftentimes will impact the setting as well. And so things to think of is, are there some unexpected things that are taboo, right? Are there some unexpected things that your audience wouldn't expect that aren't allowed? Is there a group of elite people or subservient people? Do some people rule over others while other people are put below them? Now, a lot of you are going to be making up places that have never existed. And so these are some things you need to think about. Are there rules that are different from your audience's rules? If so, you need to fill them in and let them know what the rules of this place, maybe the laws of this place are. Are they cultural rules? Are they actually laws? Are there customs, holidays, or practices that your audience needs to know? All of these things make up kind of that background setting. And so here's one more example of setting before we move on to the assignment. It's a great one by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's the beginning of The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. And so once again, Tolkien is establishing the place, right? And in this, it's just one hole in the ground, right? Now, one of the interesting things you can do is you can establish a setting by telling your reader what it is not. And so here, Tolkien doesn't tell you much about the hobbit hole, except it's not nasty and dirty and wet. It's not sandy with nothing in it. It's a comfortable place, right? And so by telling your reader what a setting is not, sometimes you get a very good idea of what it is. And that's what Tolkien is doing here in establishing the setting. So let's take a minute and check out your assignment. Okay, let's take a look at the assignment that I have for you and building your setting. And so remember that the setting of your story is really going to be the foundation for your reader's imagination. In order to get your reader invested in the story, you want to show them what the world that they're hearing is all about. And so without that, it becomes hard for your reader to immerse themselves in the story. And so I want you to practice writing setting by coming up with 3 different settings. Each setting should have a 2 to 3 paragraphs long description and should detail the following: the locale, the time of year, and time of day. And then one other thing of your choice. It can be the climate, the mood, population, or social, political, cultural environment, right? So you're doing essentially 4 things: the locale, time of year, time of day, and then one of those other choices. And so one setting I want you to make a peaceful setting. I want you to make one hostile setting, and then the final setting can be anything you want. And then highlight in that setting what it is you did to show the locale, the time of year, the time of day, and the chosen aspect, right? I want to see if you can find them in your setting. Where did you put them? What do they look like? Are you just telling your reader what the time of day is? Or are you showing them through hints? It's going to be a good thing to know whether you're explicitly or implicitly kind of showing that kind of stuff. And so I have an example here of a setting that I wrote just really quickly of somebody on the moon. And so this would be my example of what a hostile setting should look like. And you'll see here that I have locale, time of year, time of day, and mood written up here as a legend. And then I highlighted the parts of the paragraphs that were doing those things, right? And so you're going to want to do the same thing down here in the box, right? So here, write a relaxing setting, set up a relaxing setting, then highlight. You're going to have to add one more aspect. Here, write a hostile setting. Add one more aspect. Then finally, just one setting of your choice, whatever you want to describe. Try to really communicate what it's like to be in that spot. And once again, the key word here is going to be sensory detail. Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. What is it like in this place? Give as many of those sensory details as you can. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them when we show up to class next. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the assignment and good luck writing your settings.